Welcome to the next lesson in our module on how to use LinkedIn effectively. This time around, we're going to go through a few templates for sending out messages via LinkedIn, contacting people there, requesting informational interviews, recommendations, and just general outreach requests and connection requests when you're on the site. Before we start looking at the templates though, I want to go over a few points and remind you of what the site is useful for and what it's not quite as useful for. As we mentioned previously, you definitely want to have a profile on there, a relatively good one, following the guidelines that we laid out before, because this is really the main point of the site. This profile should be your number one search result on Google for your name, and you want it to be the hub of your online presence. So you definitely want it for that. When it comes to contacting people though, it's not necessarily the best method because a lot of professionals on there just do not respond to messages or respond very infrequently or never get back to you and so on and so forth. Of course, it is very useful as a tool for research, and it can be especially helpful with very small buy-side firms where you cannot find individuals listed on their websites, or they don't even have websites, or something else like that. The truth about sending messages on LinkedIn goes something like this. We got a really good comment on one of the previous networking related articles on mergers and acquisitions, and I wanted to share it here to show you the likely outcomes when you actually start sending LinkedIn messages. So as you can see here, it's a comment from Confused Guy, really good username there, and he's saying that he tried to contact people through LinkedIn and they'll accept his invitation, but then not reply to his initial email or the follow-up email. And by email, he really means message on the site there. They accept the invitation, and they might reply at first, but then they ignore him. Or a lot of the people are in groups like the Goldman Sachs group, and you cannot join unless you're actually working there. Or a lot of the people will only accept in-mails, and even if you choose to pay for those, it is usually a few dollars per email you send or per message you send. Even if you get a subscription and you pay for those, you can't send 100 of those per day. They limit how many messages you can send because they don't want you signing up and spamming people. So this person was confused about how to conduct his networking in the face of these limitations on LinkedIn. The truth is that these are very common problems, which is why in previous lessons here, we actually recommended using LinkedIn more to find people as opposed to contacting people. But the flip side of this is that there are some cases where you will get a relatively good response rate. Now, when I say relatively good, I don't mean you're going to get a 90% response rate or even a 50% response rate, but you might get, say, a 20 or 30% response rate, which is probably about the same as you would get from emailing alumni or going through referrals or something else with a higher success rate like that. In particular, there are three cases where you might get a decent response rate by using LinkedIn. Case number one is when you have extensive relevant work experience via internships or full-time jobs, and you express that experience very well on your profile. A good example would be a corporate lawyer who is now moving into investment banking or private equity. This person might have worked on a lot of deals, maybe not the financial modeling aspect, but he knows the dynamics of deals and what to expect, and he's written about those deals and those types of clients in his profile. Case number two is when you are contacting very, very specific people. So you're not just reaching out randomly to any banker that you can find. You're trying to find people who come from your country or city or region who have similar experience to you and have moved into the roles that you are now trying to move into, for example. So let's say that you're interested in working in Asia and you're from the UK or Europe originally. Well, you might look for expats who have worked at Big Four firms in the UK who have now moved to China to work in finance there. You're going to find very, very few people who actually fit this profile. In the whole country, you might be lucky to find maybe 10 to 20 people, maybe a little bit more than that, who actually match up with this profile. And if you're searching for something that specific, it is more likely that you will get a good response rate. And then case number three for the good response rate is when you found someone who is sort of a hidden gem, someone who rarely gets contacted for networking purposes, either because they are difficult to find, because he or she is disconnected from his or her undergraduate institution or master's institution or MBA institution or whatever the case may be. Or if you are starting the networking process very early, for example, if you've won admission to business school and you're just starting out networking, say 6 months in advance, before a lot of people have had a chance to get their profile together and actually start reaching out to others. Here's an example that satisfies both cases 1 and 2, and this is from a previous networking interview we did on mergers and acquisitions. And specifically, it's from a reader who broke into private equity in mainland China, which is almost impossible to do if you're a foreigner and you're not a native speaker of Mandarin. So he describes his networking efforts here and says that he used LinkedIn extensively and even used the paid options like InMail. He found people by looking for terms like China private equity, China investment banking, and looking up fellow expats from his own country who were now in China doing business. Now, this particular reader was in a country that is smaller than the UK, so there are going to be even fewer people that match that specific profile, and that was a big part of the reason why he got good results by doing this. And then he mentions doing some random Google searches as well and finding a few people like that. But then the other important part to his story, and what explains the 30% response rate that he got, is that he had a very good profile. And he had actually worked on deals at a Big Four firm. It was a little bit different from the work that you do in investment banking and private equity, but he knew the process, he knew the buzzwords to use. As he says here, he focused on contacting expats in the country. And that 30% response rate also includes people saying they couldn't hire him or flat out rejections. Given his extensive and highly relevant work experience and the specificity of his search, it is not really a surprise that he got a relatively decent response rate by using LinkedIn like this. Now, the other implication of this is that if you're a university student or a master's student, or perhaps even an incoming MBA student, LinkedIn may not be the best use of your time, especially if you're going for entry-level internships. LinkedIn tends to be far more effective for candidates like this who have quite a bit of work experience history to point to. And then here's an example of case number 3. This is an example of someone who was a hidden gem who just didn't get contacted very much for networking purposes. This comes from an interview with a reader who moved from private wealth management internships to a full-time investment banking role. So he says here that he used his alumni database as well as LinkedIn, and he often found names on LinkedIn and then plugged them into the alumni database to get contact information. Again, very much in line with what we recommended before, finding people on LinkedIn, but then getting their contact information via other methods. And as he says right here, he actually got a full-time offer from an alumnus that no one from his school had ever contacted. And there were a couple of reasons for that. First off, this particular reader went to a relatively unknown undergraduate institution, and the person he contacted had also gone to the same undergraduate institution, but then he went to a top 3 or top 5 business school. This person got a lot of people from that business school contacting him, but not as many from his undergraduate institution. In fact, no one prior to this particular reader had actually contacted this person. So that's an example of how you might find someone who has just never been contacted by someone from your school or from your firm before, and how you might get a better response rate like that. He also highlights down here that being the first person to contact an alumnus or alumna is very, very important, especially when you're at the MBA level and everyone is networking well in advance. So those are just a few examples of how LinkedIn messaging can be effective in certain scenarios and when you should focus on it and when you should not focus on it. A few other tips about what not to do over LinkedIn before we actually look at the templates. First off, you should never send out mass messages. You should really only message individuals one at a time. Just like with email, for your initial outreach, you never want to email multiple people. Keep it to one person at once. And on LinkedIn, it's actually a bad idea, even in a follow-up message, to include multiple people on it. You really want to keep it to a one-on-one communication channel. If you add someone as a connection and you include an introductory message, as you'll see in our templates coming up. In a lot of cases, the person will not even read your intro message. A lot of people really just log into LinkedIn, accept all their connection requests, and then don't check the site again for a week or 2 weeks or however long it takes. So even if you send out that initial intro message, you don't want to necessarily rely on it. You'll get ignored, people won't read it. You really have to follow up and be a little more aggressive about your outreach approach to the person. So after he or she accepts your request, send a follow-up message. If you haven't heard anything back in, say, 5 to 7 days, send another message, put in a request for a quick 5-minute call or informational interview, and make sure you do that when you don't hear back. And then finally, on the issue of InMail, in other words, paying the site to send a specific message to someone, or premium accounts, the usefulness here really varies. If you don't mind spending the money, you can certainly try them out, but you won't necessarily get much better results for many of the same reasons we've been pointing to. Even if you contact someone via one of these methods, he or she may still not respond because a lot of people just don't check their LinkedIn accounts that frequently. In general, we think you're much better off going through email because bankers and financiers are in their email accounts all day. They're not really in their LinkedIn accounts all day though. So those are some thoughts on how to use the site effectively. Now let's take a look at our actual templates here. I have up here at the top an introduction which really summarizes what we just went through on those previous slides. So I'm not going to go over all that again here. The one thing I would emphasize though is that your LinkedIn messages should be short to maximize your response rate. Even with emails, generally you will get better responses with shorter messages, but on LinkedIn, that's even more true. If you send someone a message that is 4 paragraphs long, if it's really good and you have some connection to them over email, you may get a response. But on LinkedIn, you are extremely unlikely to get a response with a message that long. So let's start by going through a few templates for connection requests. Then we'll go through informational interview requests and follow-up. And then we'll look at a template for requesting recommendations for your profile. Here's the first connection request template. This is pretty straightforward, and it's really just a shortened version of the informational interview request templates that we have elsewhere. The main difference here is that you're not really asking for an informational interview. You're just saying that you are a student at a certain school with a certain major, with previous internships in a certain industry. We found the person's name on LinkedIn, obviously because we're adding them on LinkedIn, and we're messaging them because we're interested in a certain career and we saw they work at a certain firm. So it would be great to connect and possibly speak in the future as we learn more about the industry. So this is an example of a good introductory message for a connection request, especially when you are quite a ways separated from the person, when it's more like a 3rd-degree connection, for example. You don't necessarily need to do this. If you already know the person from work or something like that, it's not as necessary to do this, but if you don't know the person and it really is a cold outreach, it's a good idea to include a short introductory message like this. Now, if you actually want to set up an informational interview with the person in the near term, then you probably want to follow up on this message with an informational interview request template, which we'll get to below. But this is just the intro for now. And you can see an executed example here, a junior at Tufts majoring in economics and finance, internship experience in private wealth management, and we want to do investment banking, and we saw this person works at Evercore. So there's really not much to say about this. It's a pretty short and simple message. If you're already working full-time, you can use a very similar message, but tweak it a little bit to support your current role. You pretty much always want to list your firm name in the subject. Even if it's a smaller firm, you want to list it there so you appear more credible to the other person. And then you want to indicate what you're looking to transition into in the next part of the subject. So you can say where you're working and where you've done internships if you've graduated relatively recently, say within the past 2, 3, or even 4 years. We found the person's name on LinkedIn. We're sending a message because we want to move into a certain industry. We saw the person works at a specific firm in that industry. And then once again, we're not really making an informational interview request. We're just saying that we're adding the person so that potentially in the future, we might be able to get some insights from them on how to make this transition into the industry he or she is in. Here's an example, someone who works at a Big Four firm, KPMG, looking to move into private equity. This person works in the transaction advisory services team, which is an ideal entry point for getting into investment banking or private equity. We list the school name, USC, internships in equity research and investment banking. And then we just have the person's firm and mention briefly at the end that we're interested in going into private equity ourselves. Now, this type of template and this type of message would be even more appropriate if this particular person had also worked at a Big Four firm before moving into private equity. If she did not, we could still send this, and it's fine. But going back to the point made earlier, the more similar the person's background is to your own, the higher the chance that he or she will respond to you. And then here's a more generic template, not really for connecting with someone for purposes of informational interviews, but more for catching up with someone or reaching out to someone that you know but maybe haven't met before, or something else like that. In this particular case, we're assuming that the person has worked before but is now moving to a new location. So maybe they worked in London and now they're moving to Paris, or maybe they worked in Hong Kong and now they're moving to Singapore, or maybe they worked in New York and now they're moving to Chicago. For this one, it's a little bit less formal because you probably know the person or have heard of the person before at least. So you can just say hi and use their name, or just use their name. You don't need to necessarily say Mr. or Ms. We include the commonality in the beginning, and then we also include where we're going to be working this summer or this year or next month or whatever the case may be, and mention that the person is also working there, so it would be great to connect and catch up when we're both in the same place. Here's the executed example. It's a Georgetown alum transition to Chicago. And we can see here the commonality is the finance club at Georgetown and how they both had some type of officer role there, and how this person is currently working in investment banking. So presumably we want to make a transition or maybe move to a different firm or something like that. We're actually working at Citadel, a large hedge fund in Chicago this summer, and saw that this person is also working in Chicago, so it would be great to catch up and connect. Again, with LinkedIn, you don't necessarily need to make a specific request. In a lot of cases, you're really just adding people to expand your network and to make it easier to research other people or other firms in the future. So in general, the messages can be shorter and you don't need as much of a call to action or specific request, especially for these initial outreach messages. Now let's move on to the informational interview request templates and look at one template for sending out the initial request and then one template for following up. This is not too complicated. It's really just a shortened version of the email template or the various email templates we've already presented. But we list our university or firm name in the subject. And here we should really change this and say student/professional. That way we just handle both cases, regardless of whether you're working full-time or still in school. We use Mr. or Ms. here to make it a little more formal, and then say we're student, or you can give your job title if you're working at university or firm name with previous internship experience in these places, and now we want to move into a certain new industry or a certain new type of role. Here, we are not softening our request for the informational interview that much. We're saying, would you happen to have 5 minutes to speak on the phone on specific dates and times? So we make it a little bit more indirect with emails, but on LinkedIn, you don't really have the space to do that. It's better to make the message shorter and not be quite as polite about it. People are used to getting these types of requests on LinkedIn quite frequently too. So on balance, it's better to make the message shorter and not make it quite as indirect here. And then we do have a comfortable decline at the end. No worries if you can't do it, but we want to ask anyway. And then here's the example. LSE student, corporate finance, career transition. We add a few things to boost our credibility in the beginning here. We're a second-year analyst at Rothschild with deal experience in TMT and then previous internships at HSBC and Google. Now, the Google one is important, and the deal experience in TMT is important because this person wants to move into corporate finance in the technology sector. So anything that relates to technology from your current role or previous role is definitely worth mentioning here, as long as you can do so in a concise way as this person has done. And then here we use the same exact language as above, so not too much to say about that. Really, the main point of this one is that you have to get across your connection to the sector that you want to move into, and you have to make it clear that you have some background and context in this industry. Now, if you don't get a response after a week or so, you could send a follow-up message and say follow up and then industry name, career transition. Here, we just put our request in the beginning instead and say that we're following up and want to see if the person can speak for 5 minutes. And we remind them of where we are currently working and what we want to move into in the next part. And then we don't exactly give a comfortable decline, but we do say we know you're really busy, so we'd appreciate any insights or time you could give us. And here, we do still have some credibility boosters because we say that, again, we're a second-year analyst at Rothschild. We do have the TMT deal experience. We leave out the bit about HSBC and Google just to make the message a little bit shorter, but same exact idea. We want to show some relationship to corporate finance and the technology sector. So that's it for the LinkedIn informational interview request and follow-up templates. Now the last template here is for requesting recommendations in your profile. We went over previously why it can be good to get recommendations, especially from more senior people. So the VP level or up if you're an analyst or associate, for example. And here's a quick message you might send for this. You might say, I hope all is well. I just wanted to reach out and ask if you had a few minutes to write a brief recommendation for my LinkedIn profile. Now, you have to remind them how you work together, especially if it's someone senior who works with a lot of junior people. So give the firm name, say whether it was a previous internship or a specific deal or a specific project, especially if it is, say, a managing director or a VP that you never really work with, but maybe you worked on once on a certain deal or a certain project. It's really important to remind them of this. Then make it easy for them by saying that the recommendation can be very short. They don't need to write a page. They don't need to write a book about how good you are. They can write 2 sentences and it would be great for you. Now, opinions vary on whether you should provide a template for the person to use, but in our opinion, it is always a good idea to do this. In the worst case scenario, the person might say, okay, that's great, but I'll write my own recommendation. You don't need to be so suggestive about what to include. But in the best case, if the person is really busy and couldn't ordinarily write this, having this template, even if it's only 2 or 3 sentences, will actually save them time and make it easier for them to just copy and paste it, change around a few words, and add the recommendation to your profile. So let's look at the executed example for this one to get more context around it. This person has worked in private equity or done some type of private equity internship at this firm, Swift River Capital. And then the language here is, Diane is one of the hardest working and most detail-oriented interns we've ever had at Swift River Capital, consistently delivered excellent work ahead of schedule, and will be a key asset to any organization she joins in the future. Now, maybe the person thinks this language is too positive or is going too over the top with the praise, but that's okay. You're just providing them a template to save them some time, and if they want to change it or make it a little bit less enthusiastic, that's okay, and they can easily do it. The real thing here is that by giving them a template, you're always going to save them time and make it more likely for them to actually reply to you. One other thing to note here is that in a lot of cases, if you've worked with someone before, it's actually smarter to email them about this rather than sending them a LinkedIn message for the same reasons we've been mentioning. A lot of professionals rarely check their LinkedIn accounts for messages, so if you have their work email address, which you should if you worked with them before, it's often much smarter to send them this same request via email instead, and then to provide a link to your profile so they can enter it directly right there. That's it for our templates and tutorials on how to send LinkedIn messages in this lesson. So let's do a quick recap and summary of everything here. As we mentioned, LinkedIn is good for establishing a presence and for finding companies and people, but is not so good for contacting people. You will often get subpar response rates when you reach out, but it can still be worth doing, especially if you have extensive irrelevant work experience, you're contacting very specific people, or you've found someone who simply doesn't get contacted very often because there's a big mismatch between his undergrad and MBA institutions, or someone who is very difficult to find or who does not have a lot of connections on LinkedIn and is therefore not very visible. When you send out these messages, you can certainly follow our templates here and tweak them as necessary. We recommend making your messages very short and to the point. And when you reach out for these initial connection requests, you don't have to ask for something specific. You can just explain why you're adding the person. And then later on, when you actually want to set up an informational interview, you can send a separate request for that. Or if you want to meet up in person, you can send a separate request for that. And the same goes for something like requesting a recommendation in your profile, for example. So that's it for our set of tutorials on how to use LinkedIn effectively. You should now have a much better idea of how to set up a profile, how to search for companies and people, and also how to contact them effectively via LinkedIn and also via other methods such as email and your alumni network and other means once you have their names via a search on LinkedIn.